into the legislature's by legislature governor. I don't know exactly how long that took. I wasn't that old in 1975. I wasn't paying attention to much of anything except for Xbox card, I imagine. But louder.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so and then the most recent the new regulations, and I shouldn't be doing air quotes, they're relatively new. 50 years ago, that freshwater wetland protection enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor. I don't think there's any kind of veto or anything like that, but the new well, actually the key part of that, the regulated wetlands were protected, whichever word you want to use. 12.4 acres or larger. Why 12.4? Anybody want to take a guess? Kind of a little history, like where we at. So that's 5 hectares. That's a measuring metric system. 12.8 acres, 12.4 acres, I should say. Same as 5 hectares. Back in 1975, somebody was telling me about the history. A lot of talk about potential metric systems. So that's how we end up with the kind of seemingly very kind of an odd number, 12.4. So that number is still in place. So wetlands that are 12.4 acres or larger continue to be protected or regulated. Okay? The new regulations include some protections for smaller wetlands. The new regulations was just kicked in or became active at the beginning of this year. So just shy of 7 months ago. Those are the result of legislation enacted, approved the legislature by in 2022. And so it takes time for those proposed regulations proposed to meet the goals of that legislation. That happened largely last year, 2024, and then that set of regulations put together by the DEC, incorporating public feedback. Those sessions were back in the late summer and the fall, and then that whole set of whole package back to the legislature, and then voted on again, and then back into and then finally starting those regulations taking effect on January 1st of this calendar year. So in 2025, the new regulations starting. The regulations include those 12.4 and larger acre wetlands, smaller wetlands of unusual importance, and there are 11 criteria. I'll list them on the slide to list those unusual importance criteria, 11 of those, and then the bullet point there, jurisdiction no longer tied to original maps. I was up at any kind of 20 some years and never really understood what the original maps actually, and what that came from. So that was the original 12.4 and higher, 12.4 acre and larger wetlands. Actually, physical maps derived from looking at aerial photos, soils maps, topography, data sets like that, and actually hand drawn on those old maps. And if anybody of you have ever looked at the environmental resource mapper, which is a really good resource, I use it every day as a sort of a quick and dirty look at resources almost on a daily basis, that shows those wetlands, original maps, light green, like a lime neon green. So that's where those are from the 80s, basically. In 2028, the minimum threshold size is going to go from 5 hectares to 3 hectares. So that 3 hectares is 7.4 acres. So that's in just a little less than 2.5 years. Okay. One of the things that we have found, answer phone calls almost every day, John, other departments probably the same thing, is folks wanting to know what kind of resources we could use to see where wetlands are, right, from a regulatory standpoint. The maps, the new maps are labeled as informational, and so they come from a combination of several sources of resources. One would be satellite imagery, right? Google Maps, look at satellite imagery, it's so much better in terms of resource, seeing what things look like from above than in the 1980s when it was from photographs from an airplane, basically, right? So that's one of the data sources. Soils maps, which are from our U.S. Department of Agriculture, topography maps of topography. The main source. I feel like I'm forgetting one of them, but that's where those informational maps come from. So those are, I think, another word for them is they are predictive. Okay, nobody is actually out there on the ground and looking at every square foot of state resources for that. So those are information, and those are on an old resource mapper that you might see online, or if somebody's maybe printed one off and you're looking at a hard copy of that, it'll be sort of a pinkish purple colors. Okay, and those include regulated wetlands, but they also include just wetlands that are not regulated. So there are wetlands smaller than that 12.4 acres. There are wetland areas that are shown in that pink purple that are not actually wet. Because if you might imagine and think about looking at imagery from above, looking down, literally from lower space, I guess is what it would be, looking down through the capacity to figure out exactly where the wetland boundaries are from above, soils maps, topography. That's not a perfect system. So the only way to know exactly where those are is on the ground. That's some of the stuff that I do from David. Not every day, but today was, pretty much figuring that out on a couple of properties. Let's see, for some of the questions that either were submitted and we got in the queue, if you will, have to do with what activities are exempt and which are regulated. Exempted means that it doesn't require a permit. It's not a regulated activity. It's something that can be done. Doesn't require a permit. Okay? Exempt activities include maintenance, repair of existing structures, so in the case of some of the questions that were submitted, like can we continue to mow lawns? The answer is yes. It's a continued maintenance. It's an existing use. So there's really nothing in there. Those activities are exempt. Resurfacing pages, resurfacing a driveway, for example. Okay, so there's just some examples. Seasonal. Lots of folks have had questions about seasonal installation, removal and installation of docks. To get an exempt of activity. Outdoor recreation, boating, fishing, hunting, trapping, etc., hiking, watching. Right, all those things are exempt activities. On the other hand, regulated activities, those that are prohibited in the regulated areas unless permits in place. Basically, you can think, I think is new. It wasn't there before, so new construction, for example, buildings, driveways, etc. The clear cutting of vegetation, clear cutting that we're talking about the trees, and so clear cutting is, if I remember correctly, there's it. So exempt from the wetland regulations is the harvesting of a certain down to a certain density or actually basin area. That minimum that must be maintained is 30 square feet per acre. What in the world does that mean? So it's not actually numbers of trees. You can imagine if my arm were a tree, and we cut it, and then the surface area of the stump, that's the basal area. So the bigger the tree, the larger the basal area. And so if I remember correctly, I think this amounts to something like, we're talking about 20-inch diameter trees. I think it's 10 per acre, something in that neighborhood. I don't have that table memorized, but it's in that neighborhood, something like that. Installation and expanding new docks. Okay, so again, that's new construction, and herbicides, pesticides are continue to be regulated. Sorry, I looked the page down. There we go. Okay. All right. Wetlands of unusual importance. One of the lists on the list. Some of the unusual importance criteria are very intuitive. They would just easily make sense to most people. They got a picture of a turtle, plant, flower, amphibian right there, and then a vernal pool in the middle. Vernal pools are typically temporary wetlands that are isolated. We don't fish in those, but that makes them excellent habitat for lots of amphibians, because most of our amphibians, not the really common ones that you go out and see every day, like green frog, but many of the other amphibians, salmon, fish, frogs, not do well at all in the presence of fish, because fish just gobble them up. So that must make those important. So these are unusual importance wetlands, and here is, there's the list of the 11 criteria. I mentioned rare plants, you know, rare, endangered, special concerns, species of animals and other invertebrates as well, with much less information about those than the vertebrates. So your, you know, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, 5 vertebrate groups. Also on the list, urban areas. So urban areas, that data, that layer, my brain thinking about GIS, that's Geographic Informational System. So essentially the digital map that shows that. Urban layer information that's driven from US Census data, the most recent data that's been collected and organized. Okay. Maps, or wetlands and floodways. So we've got floodways, areas that are typically going to be along our rivers and larger creeks that oftentimes flood. Wetlands, one of the main functions, in fact, many areas, the most important function of wetlands is to mediate, to reduce flooding. So it's reduced. And so how does that work? You got wetlands near a river or stream, water levels come up, spills over the banks, and can spread out and slow down. The back doesn't move down through the watershed as quickly. I do much of my field work is actually in the southern tier. Not a lot of wetlands in there. Those watersheds are very flashy. They flash flood damage. So a lot of culverts been blown out the last year with really, you know, when they're getting 2 inches of rain in, 24 hours, or, even more intense than that. Let's see. Okay, next slide here. The jurisdictional determination process. This has been a source of much confusion, anxiety, frustration. More words to add to that list. So I'm going to go through it. I'll go fairly swiftly. Not to avoid talking about it, but rather, getting down to the nitty gritty detail. I don't think me talking at a group is really going to do it, right? So we've got online resources to get us through this, okay? And what that means is jurisdictional determination is to determine if, in this case, if there are jurisdictional wetlands in a particular area of interest, whether it be on property or parcel, period, or on affecting a potential project area. Okay? So it's the determining and figuring out if there are any wetlands that are or adjacent area that's regulated. Okay? And so the basic tool, and this list, or this the step-by-step process, I'm going to kind of walk it back in the next slide or two, because there are ways to streamline this. Okay. First step is typically a parcel jurisdictional determination. A parcel is just another name for your property. We use the word parcel because there are lots that is very specific to a chunk of the land, right? The cell phone in my pocket is part of my property, right? So parcel. So we oftentimes use the word parcel, but that parcel jurisdiction determination is just to determine if there are jurisdictional wetlands or a 100-foot adjacent area within that boundary. Okay? That's straightforward in concept. The problem is the wetlands are not as easy to recognize in almost all cases. It's not as easy to recognize, where compared to a lake, right, or a stream, or a river, or the ocean. You're going to point to that and see that standing water. You can usually detect where that edge is really closely, like we would all have close agreement on that. Wetlands more complicated. The criteria that are dictate define wetlands. It's a combination of vegetation growing there, soil characteristics, which are the result of the system going anaerobic or not having oxygen. Because when you have water flooding, you're saturating the soil, or saturating and covering it, right? That oxygen gets used up, and you're left with very low oxygen levels, and that induces changes in soils, which induce changes in vegetation, which in turn induce changes in what kind of animals that are. Animals move around so quick, so we don't use them typically as it's not reliable. Move too quickly. Plants are rooted, kind of going into place. And also looking at the hydrology. If it's determined that there are wetland or adjacent area on a particular parcel within a particular parcel, the next step oftentimes is a delineation. To delineate means we almost always, you don't hear it outside the context of wetlands, hardly at all. It means to determine the boundary between two things. So a wetland delineation is to determine, the goal is to determine where the wetland ends and then where the non-wetland begins, or vice versa. And so that's, literally takes people on the ground to do that almost always. It's very difficult to get get it really accurate from any kind of other data set. If wetlands are present or adjacent area, then the next step might be a project jurisdictional determination. So if this screen behind me was a parcel, right? So a rectangle. And then we were interested in potentially putting a hole or something in the lower right where the, well, if you call it skyscraper, the taller building there. Okay, that's a project. Okay, it's probably not going to affect that entire area. It might affect that block in 100 feet. So maybe something like that, right? So if there's wetlands way up over here, right, that aren't anywhere near this, right, that might be a good example of a project jurisdictional determination. In this case, there is no problem with this project. In other words, it's not close. It's not none of this projects within regulated wetland or adjacent area. Right. So in some cases, we can skip this first step because we know wetland. I've talked to people almost every day who on the phone, they're describing a situation. I pull up some mapping and look at it at force level and oftentimes see that it looks like, they've got jurisdictional wetland on one end of the property of the parcel. And but it's the opposite end of where they're interested in thinking about a project. Okay? So we know that there's jurisdictional wetland there. We don't need to do a parcel JD. We know what the answer is. You go straight to a project jurisdictional determination. Scan the room to see if anybody's looking at my. I have no idea what you're talking about. There's too many faces to gauge. So if you have questions about that, right, we can come to those in the end. But remember, a parcel is what most will call the property, right? The property line, right? And then the project is a particular, usually some kind of a build, right? Building something. Okay. Right. There is, and what is going to be called the consultant option for a parcel JD or a project JD. I'll have the word parcel up here. That's relatively recently that we're saying given the go ahead to handle project JDs at the regional level. And so John and I work in Region 7. There are 9 regions throughout the state. Should throw a map at you, but in your mind's eye, you think about what New York State is shaped like. And we know where Oswego County, the city of, and then county is, that's our northernmost county from Region 7. And it gets our region gets a little wider down through Onondaga, Madison, and we go all the way down through Broome. So it's total 9 counties. So that's when we talk about a region. It's one of those 9. So the consultant option, that is where, in a nutshell, somebody would hire a consultant, somebody who's environmental consulting firms. Most of them have at least some on staff who do who do the delineation work, wetlands and streams as well. They typically do both of them together. Most of the effort is probably toward the wetlands. Streams are much easier to delineate because they're much clearer, easier to see in the landscape. Disadvantages that that costs money. Nobody does that for free, but it is a quicker way of getting results. Flip side, if you will, is that is something that my office, the Bureau of Ecosystem Health, does do for free. But it's first come, first served. We're swamped. We're backed up. It is not something that it's a oh gosh, the requests come in. It's kind of in spurts. We get quite a few of them in a short period of time, and then maybe a lag time. So it's really almost, to me, it seems unpredictable how many of those requests come in. So there's a lag time, but that works if somebody kind of thinking, maybe I'll think about this project, but I'm not really going to get serious about it for, at least a number of months and maybe get some, retirement. For example. The consultant option, the consultants, they know what is required for this. It's the same set of information, almost essentially as has been for years, decades probably. And they just get that information, they submit it to the DEC, to our office, for example, and then we review that. The verb used here is verified. Yeah, it's a review. So sometimes we go out on site and take a look at that. Sometimes we do that by a desktop review or some of both. And then you'll know whether a permit is necessary or if it's not. And in many cases, that delineation actually ends up resulting in someone tweaking their potential project plans to avoid the wetlands or permit process. The consultant option and a standard operating procedures document are available online. There's a QR code, and I made it bigger. I think should be big enough to pull up. But if you go on the DEC's main webpage and look, just search on consultant option, this is going to be right at one of those first hits. So they're easy to get to. The there's an online jurisdictional determination form, and it's an online portal, and it actually is. I'm not making this next part up. It is actually quite user friendly. So it's been for all the different kinds of testing referred to, but folks put that together, put it to the test, and then that went live beginning of the year. And I've heard directly from people who called with other questions and said, yeah, I did that. I couldn't believe how quick it was, right? So yeah, not making that up. 2-3 minutes in most cases. Right? It's contact information, some an email address to get back, and then selecting the parcel. And here's what part of it looks like. So even if it is this is included here, so it's a parcel that doesn't have a mailing address, if there's no home on, no dwelling, it doesn't have a mailbox, right? So it doesn't have a mailing address, but we know what street it is. So you can figure out, just get close to it. And then there is a little box where you can grab the map, move it around so that the blue arrow is on the parcel. Right? Sense? And then you don't actually have a mailing address. You can type a mailing address in there, then it's going to go to that, and you just double check and make sure that that is in fact actual parcel of interest. I've not heard of that being problematic at all. Doesn't mean it's perfect, because I can only report what I've heard from folks. Okay? The timeline for this, I guess in the background, what happens with those requests is there's a team of people in Albany in central office who are doing desktop reviews, and so what they put out there, put on the website with the portal is that up to 90 days, right, to do that. So if that is something to potentially think about, if the project's in mind and you don't know whether or not there's jurisdictional wetland, is to get that request in. What we hear from folks is that sometimes it's taking most of those 90 days, but they're getting it within those 90 days. If they don't, I think you can read that, right? Maybe not the mailing address. You can send a letter by certified mail, and that's simply to assure that it gets to where it's going, or supposed to go, and you get confirmation that it got there. And then if within 10 days you don't hear anything, any kind of jurisdiction is waived for a period of 5 years. You assume non-jurisdiction. I have heard of some folks needing to go to that, have not gotten anything in 90 days, and they send that 10-day letter in. But then they have gotten those letters shortly thereafter within that time. There's a water wetlands general permit, and is that what we're now? Okay, we have that here. One. Oh, So general permit, if you aren't familiar with the permitting, wetland, John can make a strange face if I get it wrong, because I don't handle permits directly. The general permits streamline the process. They are a sort of a template, I'll say the word blanket, but a template that covers a number of activities, items that are commonly, just people commonly would like to do, and then it's relatively nicely packaged, if you will, and they get processed more quickly, right? And so many activities in the regulated areas, not just wetlands, but lakes, stream banks, get permitted through a general permit. So it's a fairly big deal to have that in place. You can see the list of things that are allowed there, repair, replacement, existing structures, et cetera. Construction and modification of various structures, temporary installation of access roads. And laid down there as an example, there would be a temporary access road to be able to get equipment through a wetland adjacent area to build, somewhere that required that, and then that road's going to come. Too bad. It could be like timber fence. I've seen those in the, especially utility line, there's the basically big mats, underneath timbers, laid down as a temporary road to be able to get equipment back to an area without losing that equipment in the wetland or damaging it. Okay. There's a list of draft general permits that are under review, and so I've got an arrow next to two of them that are probably more relevant to more people than the others. If that makes sense. So, for example, management of invasive species is a general permit process, and we don't know exactly when that's going to go live, be official, but soon is the word that we get from central office. Same with that, the one down towards the housing development GP general permit. This will be applicable to a housing project that's going to have effects that are fairly minor in the nutshell. Right. Oh, there's a more complete description of that housing development general permit. So it's geared towards a relatively common activity, right? That many people are interested in. Permit issuance standards, like what drives whether permit gets or permit application gets approved swiftly or not so swiftly, or perhaps not at all. There's a three-step process that we, in the legislation that we must follow, that guides feedback on a particular project. First step is to try to avoid impacts to the resource. So you can just keep all the work out of the wetland, the adjacent area. That doesn't require a permit. Would be the best. The next step is to minimize that impact. So a really good example of this would be where, and I had these conversations with folks, at their parcel with frequency, if it becomes relevant. And oftentimes there's a way to modify the project, basically modify the orientation of the placement of driveway, house, septic system, shed, such that minimize the impact. And then the last step is mitigation. So mitigate means to essentially make up for. So that could take the form of creating, constructing some new wetland to make up for the loss, enhancement of an existing wetland to make up for that loss. Okay, so there's just some examples of that. All right, here's just an example project. So they've got a wetland and a 100-foot adjacent area shown at the top, obviously. And then if somebody has a plan that looks like this, we've got a house, a septic system there on the left, the tank, and then the lines out to the field, the leach field, and then it looks like a garage or a shed there, right? And then limit of disturbance might be how far out they want to have a lawn, for example, or how far away anticipate the ground being disturbed to get the foundation done, et cetera. And so this would be an example of a scenario that doesn't require a permit. Everything's outside of that jurisdictional area. This one is approaching a little bit on the adjacent area. This would be where we talk about probably how can we rearrange things a little bit so we're avoiding that disturbance into that resource. Oftentimes that is turns out to be something feasible. And then, this one is an example where this is a relatively small parcel. The problem is not going to get a permit because everything, there's so much there that I just can't avoid that disturbance at all. All right, just a couple of bullet points to wrap it up. I got a contact sheet or a contact slide at the end there. What we are charged with looking at is to look at impacts on the wetland function benefits, the resource there, the wetland itself, and the adjacent area. Talk about the mitigation beams, so there's that's not me. I'm not Krista's score. Krista's the one who handles most of these kinds of presentations. But one person trying to cover the whole state, that wasn't sustainable. So some others of us are doing this as well. All right. So that's why I have this slide presentation. John, we're going to swap the computers out because he's got the list of the questions that were submitted, and Kate together. And so give us like 90 seconds or so to switch.
Again, my name is Counselor Joe. I work at the permitting office. So part of the process is you're wondering if you have wetlands on the property, is you go to a Bureau of Ecosystem Health, and they'll make a determination of if wetlands are regulated on your property or not, and if you need a permit, excuse me. And so if you do need a permit, then you come to our office, and like that said, we work closely together, our two divisions, and come together with a project that both meets the goal of the applicant and also protects the environment. So that's the goal of our environmental permitting process. There's a couple of questions that I know we keep getting asked, that before we get into some of these questions, I want to address this group in particular, because I know most of you are here because of Oneida Lake and your own property on Oneida Lake. You're wondering what these regulations are going to do to your property. So one of the first things that we should talk about is there's been a misconception since this process came in that the entire lake is now regulated wetland, right? So what that would do if it was entirely regulated wetland is every property on that lake would either have protected wetland on it or protected 100-foot adjacent area. And so our wetland regulations, we regulate both impacts to a wetland and the 100-foot adjacent area around the wetland. They both have special characteristics so that New York State is determined is worth protecting for the people of the state. So if the wetlands are in the water and they go to the edge of your property, that's where, as Thad was discussing earlier, that's where the edge of the wetlands would be, and then we would regulate in the water where those wetlands are, and then 100 feet onto your property. But the issue is every property is not subject to these regulations. It's only if there are protected wetlands either in the lake in front of your property, or if there are protected wetlands on your property. So that's the expert here, but if you have, let's say, a rocky shoreline, there's not any vegetation, you don't see any weed beds out into the lake from your property, there's a good chance that your property is not regulated by Article 24 regulations, regardless of the changes. So I know that that's been a misconception about our new regulations, because every one of you here now has regulated wetlands on your property, but that is not the case. And so the second question that's associated with that is how do we find out if there are regulated wetlands on my property, if not all properties contain regulated freshwater wetlands? And I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. But as you see here, and as Thad mentioned, this is the online parcel JD submittal form. And I'm gonna page through it here. This is my information in our office down in Whitewaters Parkway. That is all the information you have to submit. All the information that you have to submit is very easy to obtain, and in fact, this last one where you have to get your parcel ID is we have links in the electronic application form or submittal form that gets you the parcel ID. So you don't even have to go into your lockbox and find out what your parcel ID is, or your tax parcel ID, I should say. So I did this today. I'm not particularly great with computers. Took me about 2 minutes. So I know everybody's concerned about the onus that they have to do to find out if there are regulated wetlands on the property. And I just wanted to show you this before we get into the questions, that it's not very difficult to find out. What it does take is it takes a little planning. Most of you, if you do own a property, you say you want to put a shed on your property, you want to find out if you need a permit for that. The thing to know is it could take up to 90 days to get a determination from the DEC. So if you are doing a project, I'm assuming you're not just coming up with an epiphany one day and you say, I need a shed all of a sudden because suddenly I have a ton more stuff that I have to store on my property, right? So what we would ask for you is to do some pre-planning and submit that submittal form over the winter. So you have 3 months basically to get the response back. And then when it's springtime, then you can move forward with your project. If you need a permit, you get your permit. If not, you'll know you don't need a permit for the next 5 years. So I did just want to share that here. Okay. And so now we'll get to the question and answers session. These questions were submitted prior to this meeting. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these pre-submitted questions and give you answers for them. One thing I will say is a lot of your questions are probably going to be very similar. So if you did submit these questions and we did answer it, we will read them again and we will answer it again, but it might not be as full the second time, full of an answer. And the other thing I want to say is I'm not sure, I dropped 50 of the handouts about the freshwater wetlands. There's a lot of good information in the Q&A webpage on our DEC website. Almost all the questions we've gotten could be answered either on that form or somewhere on our DEC website. There are a bunch of QR codes on that handout that I have. If you did not get a handout, I suggest you go onto the DEC website and just Google DEC freshwater wetlands. And within the first, 4 or 5 websites that come up, you're going to get all the information that you would probably need. If you can't find it there, you can definitely contact the DEC, the Syracuse regional office, and we can get you those answers. So, I will pass this on to Ted. Question number 1 then.
Okay. Is that big enough to read?
Yeah.
Make that a little bigger. Make it as big as we can. Looking back at.
Okay.
Get there?
I can read it for
Yeah. Another notch or 2 if you can get it a little bigger. Let's get quite there. I think the question was somebody could show us a map that just designated what there's going to be on an idle lake with the 100-foot buffer. Would be beneficial for everybody to see on the map so they understand where these areas. Cool. Oh, so there's the environmental resource mapper is a really helpful tool as a, I'll say quick and dirty, but a first look at where jurisdictional wetlands are, and those informational wetlands. Unfortunately, here's the fortunate part, it does not include yet where the jurisdictional wetlands are in the lakes, like Oneida Lake, Gasnobi Lake, etc. Right? There's a GIS layer that also includes the unusual importance layers for all those unusual importance criteria. But that's not something that, many folks are necessarily familiar with and using. So that's those resources are in progress. This is something for resource mapper. Real quick. So the resource mapper is where we can see the green areas are those are the previously mapped wetlands that have been regulated since as a result of the original 1975 legislation. Right? The informational map layer is going to be lots of pink, and what we got to keep in mind as well that the actual boundaries on the ground are something that need to be verified and confirmed by somebody on the ground. Sometimes those boundaries are much wetland is smaller than it's shown. I've not found examples where it's really much bigger than it's shown. But again, unfortunately, it doesn't include what's in the lakes yet. The best place to figure that out is like John just walked through that online portal and request for a jurisdictional determination.
Yeah, I apologize. We don't have the internet right now. I do apologize.
So that's called
That's the most important thing.
environmental, resource map. So that is. All right, so. So next question is, what activities / projects would require a DEC permit / jurisdictional determination for a lakeshore property where the existing home is located within the 100-foot buffer zone from the shoreline? So basically, if the home is within that, within 100 feet. Okay? So go back to, if you remember that slide I had in the presentation, in a nutshell, think about it, if it's new, like new stuff, new digging for a septic system, new substantial digging for, I don't know what else you would do, a bunch of digging for once the home is already there. And those kinds of activities, substantial excavation or fill are regulated when you permit, but routine maintenance, already existing uses like
Yeah, so as we discussed, the continuing lawful use of your property is not going to require a permit. So mowing the lawns, maintaining your house is not going to require a permit. Ordinary maintenance or repair of existing functional structures, facilities or improved areas, including not limited to bridges, roads, highways, culverts, railroad beds, bulkheads, docks, beaches, piers, wharves, pilings, dolphins, utility ditches. That does not require a permit either. So if have a dock and you have a piling that needs replaced, to re-drive that piling and replace that piling does not require a permit. To replace the boards in the dock, that does not, as long as you're not reconstructing the dock, which is over 50%, that does not require a permit from the DEC. For some of the, yes.
Distinction between, initially it said exempt activities to maintain and repair existing structures, but then subsequently it was discussed freshwater wetland general permit do the same thing. So I don't understand when it's exempt and when it needs a general permit. Sounds like something a lot of people would generally be doing.
Yeah, so again, it goes into like reconstruction. say you need to rebuild a structure on your property like a shed. If you have to repaint it, if you have to fix the roof, stuff like that, doesn't require a permit. That's maintenance, right? If you have to tear the structure down and it's a little more intensive, it's gonna probably result in some soil disturbance. That requires a permit. Many of those, appurtenant structures, residential structures are covered by one of those general permits. So like that was saying, the advantage to a general permit is that you can design your project to meet those general permits. And then, these are low impact, projects like small sheds, driveways, pools, stuff like that. If you can design them to meet the requirements, outlined in the general permit, you don't get an automatic pass, but those type of activities have been generally predetermined to meet our permit issuance standards, and you'll get a permit for that activity.
Now, you said
You still have to
50%.
submit,
repair. Now what if it's damaged through, positive lightning? Say, and it's damaged more than 50%. Now you gotta get it.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of some of these general permits that we are creating now, because we understand that we are gonna have a lot more permitting for probably a lot of projects that don't have significant impairments to the wetland, is that we are gonna have an even further expedited process than we had previously. So the general permit that came out, it's called the Basic Freshwater Wetlands General Permit, has certain activities within it that are covered under what's called a notice of intent. So you submit the notice of intent to us if it's covered by one of those in the general permit, one of those activities, it's covered by the notice of intent. You submit it to us, and after 10 business days, if you don't hear from us, you can go ahead and do the work.
And what happens if you decide later that it wasn't appropriate? What if you make a repair and you really needed to have some application that you didn't know you were even on the wetland? Because you haven't given us a definition of wetlands yet.
You try to like bounce back potential scenario, I think you may be asking, that's what we're saying. Some activity that is regulated, do it, and not aware that it's within a wetland,
Or within 100 feet.
but within 100 feet, yeah, so. I guess generally speaking, if it's something that would be potentially permittable, like it would have gotten in
Building permit?
eligible for a permit, then that's typically, sure the right word is, we take that, take it into consideration, working with environmental conservation officers, for example, right, their default is, let's go see what we can just educate things, the point where it's.
John, we gotta go through the questions and then we'll have the other folks answer questions.
Sure.
quick question, what about planting a garden for a fruit tree?
Yeah, we'll get to the questions. We'll get to those questions after we get to the ones that we're saying. But I think your question's gonna be answered.
Thank you.
Julie. So here is just to finish answering the previous question. Here's the general permit that is already, has already been issued. So, it even includes septic systems in, the adjacent area of the wetland. And then if you go to the bottom, this elevated walkways and platforms. And so this number 4 here is gonna hit a bunch of the residential projects. Construction and or modification of the following residential, commercial, industrial, or public structures. The key here is there's no more than 1/4 acre freshwater wetland adjacent area disturbance. So that's a pretty decent size for somebody to do a project that, that's a large shed or, pool. So. Selective cutting of trees. Routine beach replenishment. And then if you look down at the end of the general permit. This shows all the activities and whether they need signature by the DEC to be approved. Or if you have that 10-day notice of intent. So you can see the repair, reconstruction, and in-kind replacement of existing functional structures and facilities within the wetland adjacent area or the wetland is just the 10-day notification.
Go back to, beach compliance.
Number 9.
Okay, so that's sort of gonna be the direction we're taking with the general permits that are being issued. Some of the larger ones like solar general permits, it's a little more intensive to get those applications, but for the most part, the residential general permits, you know, the projects that you're gonna be doing on your parcels are gonna be covered by these general permits and hopefully an expedited review. Sometimes you won't even hear from us prior to you doing the project, because we look at your application, we understand that it's approvable, you have 10 days, you can do the work, and then at some point we'll close the loop by issuing the permit.
Thank you, detail.
It's under, routine beach maintenance. Then go back to the next, the questions have been, I think there's a fillable, a PDF fillable form for the, applying for that general permit that John's going through, and, it's, if that doesn't mean anything to you. We snail mail, USPS Postal Service mail out hard copies as needed. People request those sometimes. Some folks, don't do computers, use computers. So, that is a capacity that we certainly have to mail out those applications. And finding that lots of folks who call and describe, what we need to do to get a permit application together. Oftentimes they've got, somebody in their family who is more computer savvy, if you will, and do it that way, and that works. Next question on the list is, what are the size criteria for a vernal pool to be considered quote unquote unusually important? So those are the criteria. So a vernal pool, I may have mentioned recently, vernal pool is usually a temporary wetland that is relatively isolated from a permanent body of water that has fish. So those are excellent spawning breeding habitats for amphibians and some invertebrates. So the answer to that is there is no size criteria per se, other than has to be big enough to be functional. And functional is defined by whether or not there's criteria developed for X number of egg masses from particular salamander and other amphibian species, wood frogs, for example. And so that's the shortest answer to that question. That's a registering vernal pools. That's a voluntary process. So this is all fairly new. This is new territory for all of us. I'm not even aware of any vernal pools having been registered in our region, and I think I probably would have heard of that by now. Just based on what we work with and talk with on a regular basis. Next question, other than DEC personnel, does DEC intend to allow trained professionals, engineers, consultants to perform jurisdictional determinations? So, not to actually perform and get the final word on that, but actually gather information and submit that for review, so they can propose jurisdictional determination, just as they consultants have been doing it for decades. So the process is in that area is basically unchanged. Probably significant changes is having them submit shape files. Shape files are basically latitude, longitude, hit their points on the landscape collected. They can be used in the GIS software.
All right, so the next question. If I understand correctly, DEC is the governing agency regarding wetland designation. If so, who will homeowners apply directly to at DEC in order to get permits for changes or alterations that fall within the 100-foot rule from the shoreline? That being said, then the town of Cicero Codes Enforcement Division is no longer the permit issuing agency. Is that correct? All right, and your friendly local town codes enforcement officer was kind enough to answer this one, so I'll read his. It has always been necessary to obtain a permit from the DEC for any work in wetlands and associated adjacent areas regulated by them. That is their jurisdiction of authority. The town of Cicero's responsibility of authority is for New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, the town of Cicero zoning code, and floodplain management regulations. Permits from the town are necessary for changes or alterations regulated by these codes, even if they are within DEC regulated areas. In those cases, a permit will be required by both DEC and the town of Cicero. There's no change going forward, and that's the most important part that was hit right there, is that that's always been the case. So anytime you're doing your work, you may have multiple jurisdictions that you have to get permits or approvals from, local, state, and federal. So that's your responsibility to do that. So nothing has changed other than now the DEC has more area that is regulated freshwater wetland. With these new regs changes, our zoning to wetlands, which should reflect our property assessment. With that 100-foot buffer from the front and back of our entire property will be considered wetland. With the new wetland changes, let me just back up here. Yeah, so just again, to be clear, not every property on an island will have lands or waters regulated as protected state freshwater wetlands. We do regulate under Article 15 for any excavation or fill within the lake. That's always been the case. So anytime you want to do anything below the mean high water elevation, you do need a permit from the DEC. However, if a protected state wetland is within the lake, in front of your property or even on your property, proposed activities may be regulated under Article 24 of the ECL. That includes areas within the wetland proper and associated 100-foot adjacent area. And then the next part of the question is, with the new wetland changes, do they have to do with Micron and the displaced wetlands? If so, how does that benefit those of us who will be affected, tax breaks, etc.? The new regulations have nothing to do with the Micron development. Or can you see the answer there? We're gonna go through the questions and then we'll have time for one. Yeah. Okay. To understand the wetland location, is it fair to say that the designated area is 100 feet from the shoreline? So if the protected state wetland is within the lake in front of your property, again, it's not always there. On your property, proposed activities may be regulated under Article 24 DECL. Again, we talked about both the regulated activities and exempt activities here tonight. So if there are regulated wetlands there, that's the next step of the process, is to see if it's exempted or if it requires a permit. So that does include the area within the wetland proper and associated 100-foot adjacent area. Again, we talked about that's the regulated area, both the wetland and 100 feet outside the wetland.
And the next question was, if this is the case, since if the shoreline is very irregular, the 100-foot border could change relatively quickly based on the shoreline changes, correct? Question mark. So it's a good question. The wetland boundary, the wetland, if there's jurisdictional wetland out in the lake, right? The inner or upslope boundary is, it's not going to be right where the water's edge is. It's probably going to be very close around Lake Oneida. where you've got a relatively, I mean, once the landscape around the lake is relatively flat, but if you get down and start thinking like on the scale of inches or feet, when we get down close to the lake itself, and it's typically got a drops off the bank, so that wetland boundary is going to be right in that, within feet, oftentimes of the normal, well, I'll say, where the water oftentimes is in terms of how high it is. So, I think that makes sense. So, all right, we know our water level in the lake fluctuates, right, up and down, and therefore how far this way, right, how far towards the lake it is at low water, and how far that water level comes up, like, right, snow melt, right, heavy rains, the water level comes up, so then that water level actually comes back inland, like I'm inland and I'm looking out the lake, right? So the wetland boundary is gonna be where, it's gonna be somewhere, probably close to where that water comes up at the highest level. But basically where the vegetation, is significantly altered by the fact that it's saturated for, if it's saturated for substantial portions of the growing season year to year. So it kind of goes back to what is the definition of wetland and used for. Good night.
No, it's just,
Okay.
you mentioned that you were gonna measure from the mean water line. Right? Well, 908's regulated at a certain height
Right,
by the Canal Corporation, something.
yeah, so
So you won't have that,
don't have as much fluctuation as would be absent
Yes.
of control, but it does fluctuate, right?
a little bit.
So what I'm getting at is the wetland has defined the boundary between where we actually see water and upslope. Ultimately, obviously, we get out of wetland where that boundary is, right, is determined by where the soils are saturated long enough during growing season that falls from the plant.
Okay.
It's the same approach, the same as wetland delineation anywhere else in the landscape. All right. Oh. There's a question when. Okay, when speaking of the 100-foot buffer, is that the aforementioned 100 feet from the shoreline? Or is it an additional buffer that extends beyond that initial designated area? The answer is, it is not in addition to, there is one single 100-foot buffer or adjacent area associated with regulated wetlands. So it's 100 feet from the edge of the wetland, which might be right at that water's, essentially right at the edge of the lake, within feet, if you will. All right.
Sure. So this next one, I'm just gonna touch on quickly, what specifically will require a permit from the DEC is the activity talking about earlier tonight. Some of them are exempt, some of them are not. So if it is in question, feel free to reach out to the DEC to figure out if that's an exempt action or not an exempt action.
Next one, there's a couple of questions that are, there are different questions, but the answer is the same. Like, so if there's an existing fire pit on the property with loose stone or crushed run being laid down around it qualifying for the permit, the answer is, yeah, that would count as an accessory structure. It takes less than 1/10 of an acre, right, and fall in that GP. Same with,
Hey,
Can you say that again?
right,
you need a permit to have a fire pit, it's basically what you decided.
so the question is not that, but it is significantly add. Right,
So again, maintaining something does not require a permit. If it's existing, it doesn't require a permit. If you want to put a fire pit in, so fire pits can mean lots of things, right? It can be sitting, a metal fire pit on your yard, that's not gonna require a permit, right? It might mean building a large stone structure with a professional, landscaping company. Yes, that would require a permit. So again, if it's an apartment structure and it's under 1/10 of an acre, you will most likely be covered under that 10-day notification. So before you build that structure, you can submit your permit application and then do it in 10 days. You'll hear from us. The existing driveway on the property, we want to expand it, that would definitely require a permit. That's one of the activities covered in the general permit. Will the permit from the DEC and the town of Cicero be required, or will the DEC only suffice? Again, DEC estate permit does not supersede any of the local jurisdictions in this case. So you need a permit from, the DEC and potential from the town. What is the turnaround time? Again, we talked about right now, it's 90 days maximum turnaround time. The program that we're trying to put into place understands that that's a long period of time for some people. And we're trying to get to a more automated program for our central office staff to implement. So as we get rolling and more experience, that 90-day time frame should be reduced significantly.
What is the exact process to obtain that? So that's the that jurisdiction determination process, the online portal, plug in information, then get that the like I described earlier, an alternative, but most private homeowners don't pursue it because it's, you know, costs money, sometimes more money than like you, but that consultant option, okay.
Excellent.
I want to know if my property is officially regulated as part of a wetland or adjacent area under the new rules. We already touched on that with the KP process. Is my yard, and if my yard is entirely within the 100-foot buffer, and I still mow my lawn unguarded or remove dead or diseased trees without a permit? Yes, for the most part, yeah.
Thank God.
What is the process and timeline for receiving the jurisdictional determination? We went over that, it's up to 90 days. What happens if DEC misses the 90-day response window?
So if you don't get a response in 90 days, the procedure is, it's listed at the bottom of that same page, must go to initially submit it. But it's to send a by certified mail, a notification that, you know, in 90 days, and then the central office has 10 days after that to get something back to you, or if they don't, then they can sue non-jurisdiction for 5 years.
I mean, the people who live right on the lake, I borrowed a rangefinder from a friend that's an archer, and I had my mother stand down by the lake. I stood on the front of my deck. I know she was 66 feet away, so now I get a much better idea how far 100 feet is. And it was a simple way to find out.
Where did the 100-foot come into play? Why isn't it 50 feet? Why isn't it 25
Yeah, it has to be.
feet? Where did the 100-foot come into play?
That's, as far as I know, it's the original legislation from 1975.
Because you get in the journey with the whole group. You fight it.
Next question is, if a determination says it on the regulated area, regulated wetland, but I disagree, what's the appeals process? So that is also described at towards the bottom of that jurisdictional determination webpage. Basically, I think in a nutshell, you send in there's actually an appeal application, and that would, I've never handled one, I've never seen one yet, but I've only been in the department a little over a year, so think of that what you will. But that would, I think that would end up in regional office, come out and take a look, see if that jurisdiction was in error. So for example, if you were to get an example, I think of if you were to get a letter of jurisdiction, letter that indicated there's jurisdictional wetland on some part of the parcel, and you think that's just completely off. That would, you know, be something that you better keep.
Next question. We only got 15 minutes left. Is it possible for us to, you to answer those questions online? Let the people here ask questions.
We're gonna work through these first, and
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the way it was set up. That's not.
Do I need a jurisdictional determination every time I want to make a change, or one determination cover the project in a period of time? That said earlier, once you get a determination, that's good for 5 years. What, what common homeowner activities now require a permit through the DEC, such as shoreline maintenance, installation of a shed, or building of a deck? So there are two wetland regulations that apply here. One is where the wetlands are under 664. That has changed, and now, as we've talked about, there's larger areas of the town of Cicero that are regulated by the DEC, that they're Article 24. However, how we issue permits and what we allow is not changed under regulation 663, or freshwater wetland permitting. So the permit issuance standards, as Thad discussed earlier about the 3 steps, to meet permit issuance standards are the same as they've always been. I think we hit the.
Yeah,
Those- Okay.
What are the costs?
What are the permit costs for minor residential projects? So if it is covered under a GP, there's no cost. Some of the other minor but larger projects, there's a $100 application fee.
Next one, if I make a small change without realizing requiring a permit, will I be fined? Or grace for education for homeowners? Small changes generally not, so I interact with our ECOs, environmental conservation officer, pretty frequently, and their default, these are my words, not their policy, their default is to try and turn around things that are negatively affecting the regulated resource. Sometimes it could be as simple as just undoing what somebody did, right? So, a small change, what exactly, that can mean any number of things, but typically, fines don't come into play. So, in terms of education, I'm throw in there as well. The other questions that if we don't get to them tonight, or we don't get to them by email, is give us a call as well. We're taking phone calls every day and explaining various things, including that talked about here today.
How does your agency police those?
Somebody
goes out and,
It's
ignores the law,
yeah, it's
and goes out and does something. How do you find out about it, and what do you do about
it's a combination of direct observation by environmental conservation officers or staff like myself who are familiar with what is regulated, which is not. Sometimes it's calls or emails from the public as well.
Tired to,
Let me, and what happens if I purchase a property in the buffer zone? Will, as the new buyer, be held liable for previous violations or unpermitted improvements? The answer is exceedingly unlikely. And the only scenario I can think of is that, I don't know, if somehow there's some mix up between somebody knew that they had some part of that, it's a violation. For any of the things that we've talked about here, it's not something that happens.
So everything there now is exact. Pretty much. I think that's bad. Existing, yeah.
Will there be any legislative or policy changes to better balance homeowner rights with environmental protection in developed lakefront areas? So the general permits are the way that we're best trying to handle the workload. Other than that, any policy or legislative guidance would be with your, local elected officials in the government.
Next one, the reclassification anyway intended to serve as a mitigation for stuff related to micron cost. The answer is no. This all predates any movements about micron. The legislation is from 2022, and basically took 3 years to get regulations draft regulations put together, out there public comment, et cetera. The next one, the existing GPs and GPs that are upcoming, designed specifically to minimize the burden, the time it takes to get projects permitted. And then this last one, talks about the impact of the new Oneida Lake Wetlands Plan. Is there a Oneida Lake Wetland, or are we talking about the 9-element plan? I'm wondering. This is a question that, John, I don't have an answer for right now, so, he's talking to somebody in Google and, direct that question to the Office of Indian Nation Affairs. I'll get some context on that, some kind of a answer to that question. All right, is that?
Number 6, talk about property values and desirable. Right out, that's what I hear, yeah. Right.
Yep, so the maintenance, so basic maintenance is exempt, right? So that can, doesn't require any permit. There's no additional, anything going on there. With new types of construction, then there are the general permits, developed for development.
The bottom part, the property values and the selling of your home or the
I don't know what's.
everything that we're reading is talking about in other areas where this is done, they're worried about the decrease in your property value. And if you go to buy a house, you're not necessarily looking for a home that's on wetlands, you're looking for a home that's on a lake. And how that's going to affect homeowners, whether they go to sell, whether they're getting a loan or they're, right, things change.
So the general permits specifically developed with an eye towards that adjacent area. Homes are not, unless they're built on a wetland back before, the old regulations were in effect, right? They're supposed to be up in the adjacent area. So that's what the general permits specifically developed for, to streamline the process as much as can be.
But you still have to submit for it.
It's kind of like the.
For activities that are regulated. That.
John, was that the last question on number 7?
It was.
Okay, I have 13 folks who signed up that want to speak today. We're gonna let those folks speak. I'm gonna pass it off to John Nostikos, who's still here. Not here. Is Judy White here? I'll bring the mic over.
Sir, we're going by who signed up.
I'm standing up so you can see me. I'm really standing up too. First of all, what about spider spraying? So many of us spray, and I was reading that pesticides. We need to get a permit to have a person come in to spray our property for spiders.
Obviously don't live on the lake.
No, if you're not treating vegetation on your property or the lake, it's not good for.
But you're within 100 feet of the wetlands.
But you're not spraying it on
No,
the property, right?
No.
On your structure.
on
right?
the structure,
Yeah,
yes.
so that would be required.
Okay, I'm a real estate agent and, it would be helpful that when this was put into effect, that the overlay for the wetlands followed along with the overlay for the floodplain. Because we are required to determine if a property is in a floodplain. So now we're gonna be required to determine if it's in a wetlands. I think this is really not fair to the homeowner to sell, new buyer to buy, because 90 days is ridiculous for someone to have to file a permit just to find out that they don't need a permit. Or if new home,
Jurisdiction determination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, when.
So this has been the case the whole time. So we deal with realtors all the time on whether or not properties are regulated wetland areas. So they can disclose that in their realty documents. So nothing has really changed in that way other than, again, there will be more wetlands.
But it has changed because we have no way, I live on an island. My family's been there for the early or late 1800s. I just don't understand how it is determined specifically what makes one area wetlands and one area is not. You talk about weeds or you talk about vegetation. We all got vegetation. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
confusing.
So that's the expert in that, and I'll pass the microphone to him in a second. But again, if somebody's selling their house, and I understand this isn't always the case, but if somebody's selling their house, it's usually not like a split decision. So if somebody's thinking about selling their house and they come to you for your assistance, the planning ahead of time to submit the jurisdiction determination request should be incorporated. Into part of the
But
process.
you're saying 90 days. Somebody needs to help sell their house tomorrow. And it will close in 90 days.
Yeah, and so in certain circumstances, as Thad was saying, is we can sort of try to make the process, if it's justified, shorten the process. So you can always reach out to the DEC, our offices, and we can discuss the situation and try to come to
Who reaches out? The homeowner or the buyer or the seller? Who reaches out?
I would guess it would be the seller's responsibility.
Okay, just so everybody knows.
And then I can talk about, how to differentiate between the wetland and non-wetland areas.
I guess I've had all three call in the past, realtor, potential buyers and sellers. And to the extent that and the time I've got, and try and then as much meaningful information as possible. Sometimes it's as simple as I can look and see, okay, there's no wetland in this area. And I get those calls sometimes from folks who, are not familiar with the environmental resource, or any of the resources to get anywhere with it. And I, pull that up and look at that. Sometimes the parcel is large, sometimes the parcel is large enough that it's very obvious that there's a big chunk of it is not wetland or in the 100-foot buffer zone. So I can sometimes give them enough of a description, what I'm seeing on that map. If it's a large enough parcel, right, it's not, there's plenty of room, if you will, between the wetland, the adjacent area and the other end of the parcel.
Most parcels on an ag lake are 50 foot wide, that is an average. The depth normally is 175 feet, some are more than that.
Mhm.
There are several houses on Lakeshore Road that set right in the middle of their property, which is 125 feet long. So, I mean, there's some serious situations here. I have one more thing just to make a statement. Well, first it says right here, number 7, it's not a legal requirement to obtain a JD through, though it is advisable to consider the potential risk. I just thought everybody know, because you know that this. One other question, there's a state ditch in Muskrat Bay and Beach Road. It's been there for 200 years. It was engineered. It hasn't been snagged in probably 60 years. If that ditch was snagged, that would alleviate a lot of the wetland flooding issues that go on Beach Road and Muskrat Bay Road. I wish somebody in the state would look into that.
Thank you.
Is Merton here? Nice, no, it's like Merton. No, Merton. Is William Walker here?
Very good. Are the maps gonna change again?
I have several questions, actually. First question is, I don't know why you're telling as far as I know, the wetland is 500 feet, not 100 feet. Not from the shoreline of the lake, but from the wetland, it's 500 feet, New York State law, beginning January first, when we had a conflict with that lady you had in there, she agreed, it's 500 feet. No, yeah, well, I believe it is.
They said it was a 500 foot check though.
Yes, there's a check zone. Were you at the Lake Association meeting? Is that what you're discussing, sir?
No, I was at a meeting in, Western Town Hall.
No, actually, we got rid of the 500 foot check zone on the environmental resource mapper that Thad was explaining before. We used to have a 500 foot check zone on that around our map wetlands. And that was to give everybody a good indication of if you are close to this wetland, come to the DEC and see if you need a permit. The regulation and the New York State law has always been 100 feet.
Okay, well, my house, I live in Shaw Road down in Western, 100 feet from the shoreline.
You don't know.
100 feet from the shoreline is halfway to my house, and I got a swamp behind me, so 100 feet from there, I have no property. And you're gonna tell me I can't do anything on that?
Was it regulated before? I know there's a lot of
No, there's
wetlands
no
that were
100 foot from the
regulated.
lakefront. There's no, lake wasn't designated wet,
Yeah,
wetland.
that's the thing.
There were portions of Oneida Lake on the North Shore in particular, and down Lake Beach Road that were previously regulated wetlands.
South from beach to south.
No, I know that. I know Beach Road is, but you said on the North Shore, right, sir? Yeah, so there on the northwest side of the lake, there are a lot of previously regulated New York State wetlands.
Big Bay.
Big Bay area, 3 Mile Bay, yeah, in those areas, those were all previously regulated by the DEC and most likely the Army Corps of Engineers.
Army of Engineering, Department of Regulation.
The Army Corps of Engineers, they're regulatory. Buffalo District.
Dr. Diane Ritter. Is she here with us? Here you go.
I just want to say, thank you so much for talking about the lake not being totally a wetland. I think it would really help a lot of people out to have a clear definition of what a wetland is and where we can find that information. Because, I've been here for a while and, I don't think I'm near a wetland, but I don't know for sure. So is there a place where we can find where the wetland is? Where the wetlands are on the lake, kind of associated with the lake?
So I've got on my notebook question to try and pin down, answer that question. I don't have the answer. But to make a good faith bona fide effort, because it's a question I just haven't encountered, because I don't, just haven't had any, myself,
You had
projects.
earlier, right?
Yeah.
Right, the environmental resource map. Yeah, but that does not yet include the information layer on in the lakes. So that's the problem. So that's what. Towards that.
I mean, you guys, I feel for you guys, so much of this stuff now happened, and Rebecca I lived through, well, we're gonna do this, and we did do that. Just realize, for a thing, I mean, this is not planned well. And I feel for you.
Rhonda Greenlee, she here with us?
You were going to, sir, you're going to explain what determined if
Oh,
you were
Wetland
in the
definition.
wetland or you weren't in the wetland in terms of in the lake.
Right, okay, so, in the original legislation, and this is, wetlands out to no deeper than 6 feet. Problems with that, and I know this because wetland ecology is, what's 6 feet, that changes over time, at the lakes level, creeks level, changes over time. So you can think of it on average. As I understood that question, was, I'll come up with the title, somebody who I'll be asking some of these questions to in the coming days is, what's the relationship between what's the original regulations and what has actually happened in the last 50 years in a nutshell, was basically that was just been overlooked. That's my word, not theirs, basically unenforced, I guess, if you will, right? That in the water out to as deep as 6 feet My 6 feet is loosely based in science. It depends on the water clarity, how much vegetation we grow in there, or does not, right? So that's, kind of where this is our, I would say this is our biggest hour collectively. Just in the room, but I mean, across the state, other people were talking about the regions. This is one of the biggest things we've got to get
Yes, sir.
figured out, basically.
What does my next definition, then, isn't everybody around the lake?
Question, now, so
Does it have those vegetation, does it have to do with?
It's gonna be
Does it
based
have
on
to do with
vegetation,
fish?
yeah.
What does it have to do?
it'll be based on vegetation. So
And
the
where-
regulations,
Have you
areas with-
determined all that yet?
no, I'm not, I mean, we've not, including me. So that's what I've got here, a clarification on.
Seems like it's a pretty big order. I mean, this is only one lake in the
Okay,
state.
we're gonna move on to the.
Okay, so, yep, we do have a system for, we're gonna get, John and I and others, get, answers to some of these ones that we don't have.
We have Rhonda, she wants to speak.
Well, I understand that you can have shoreline property on Oneida and not be considered part of the wetland buffer zone. How do you determine, or how can I find out if my property is not considered part of, not considered part of wetland?
Right. So
Now, I
that,
understood that there was a thing that you showed on the thing where you could fill out a form and then you could, and then they would tell you whether you were part of the wetlands or not, is that correct?
that is correct.
Okay, where do you find that on the website? Cause I just looked it up, I can't find it anywhere. So can you tell me how to use like header and stuff like that?
You Google DEC
I went. to-
freshwater,
I
I'm
went-
telling you right now. If you go to DEC freshwater wetland jurisdiction determination. That should bring you right to that form.
You have a slide on it? Yeah, but I don't know where. Oh, you are? Oh, you are. Okay. I thought you had it up there. That was in Denver. Because they did that once.
So an easy way to remember that is we call them JTs, jurisdiction
Right, yeah,
determination.
but that's fine, so that is also Google, and that form should come up.
That form will, it will explain the process. The form will come up. There's a link right in the middle of the web page.
Okay, so how long does it take to end up getting that determination? Just to know whether you have it or not.
That's the 90 days. Up to 90
So it's
days.
just take 90 days to determine, because I don't have a project right now, but I want to know whether I need the permits and stuff like that.
It's, gonna require max, so some are doing it.
They're gonna require, it's it from DEC, because you already said you have no way of determining these things yet. So it's vegetation, so this is the lake, a wetland, there's no vegetation, so how that is determined are.
Gotcha, good question. So on my list of asks is what central office doing in the case of requests like, she just asked about wanting to know. Curiosity or a potential plan that we've got a project in mind.
Okay, is Lauren Pratt here? Not here, how about Sandy? Margaret, I think it's Margaret, or Master. Marcia. Maureen Jones,
Question, Brandon.
your question, thank you. Robert,
Thanks.
Robert,
Okay.
gotcha. How about Carol or Gordon Young? Okay, we're gonna wrap this up. If you have any questions?
Oh, I thought I put,
There's a question.
my name was on that list.
What's your name?
Martin, you got me?
Martin.
Martin, there was two clipboards back there. Did I sign the wrong one?
Oh, no, I read your name earlier.
Oh, I missed it.
Got it, but.
Okay.
Questions I got?
One question. Does this involve?
We'll get to you, we'll get to you next, sir.
Okay.
Okay, you know what? All farming are, have wetlands, is that 100 foot, 500 foot? We regulate the wetland proper. I'm talking the buffer zone, and 100 feet outside. So 100 feet, yes. How do I get someone out there and measure that for me, because
No, you can't use the maps. 2 years ago, I tried calling, it's not your guys' fault. No answers, no return of voicemails, no return of emails, I was given the person's name who was in charge of it. Voicemail, never came back. Do I fill out a form? To get someone out there, and if I do, you guys are so backed up that. It could be like a place like a queue where I see where I am on your list. And then my last question is your contact.
Let me start with it.
Contact me.
I'll give you my contact. I gotta look it up.
I wouldn't either, don't get it up.
Not your guys' fault. No, I didn't know that I'm, 908 fish hatchery, find someone's number because nobody was picking up on it.
I'm not sure, I
Like
apologize.
I said, it's 2 years ago, so I'm not holding anybody here responsible. It was just my personal experience.
If anybody has any trouble contacting anybody specific in the, you can call the main number for the Sarah's office. And we'll make sure that somebody gets in touch with you.
That was the one that, never mind. I already made my fight them, this side.
I can't speak to that, I do.
You know,
Yeah, so for your system help, that's, I work out of this Portland field office and all the other biologists as well. We all, we cover more or less by county. So, the office, the office, the receptionist answers the phone, ask, let her know you're interested in getting on the list for a wetland delineation. Say Oswego, yeah. So 607 607 753
753
3095.
3095.
From the beginning, 607 753 3095.
We talked about all these ones.
It's more, we don't need the information.
So that would be the
Contact information, address, basically gotta be able to get the permission to.
maybe something one online, fill out or distributing.
Usually email or post, that's the one. You can usually email it to the people who work, if they want a copy mail, you want that.
Take this over here.
Gentlemen, you have, time for a couple more questions?
Does this land include Chittenango Creek or just the lake property?
So in any wetlands, yeah, with any water body, it depends on if they're wetlands within that water body.
It's up to the mouth, the lake.
It would be specific to your property if there are wetlands in front of it, I'm not sure.
Lawns and $500,000 homes.
Anyone else? One more?
So I'm like probably a good and a half mile away from any lake or river, stream, anything like that. And when you look at the mapping, like the purple, it covers like 85% of my property. Does that mean, which most of my property is an old farm? It was all dug up, it is now clay. And it is bone dry, cracked clay, most of it. And how is that still wet?
So I'll go back to, well, I was gonna, didn't want to interrupt your question.
Yeah.
You know, the maps are not perfect. All right, from satellite imagery, topography, soils. So they're and there's informational factors are without a doubt incorrect in places. I've seen in the southern tier, for example, linear feature that look like a caterpillar. And then when I've been out on site, out of curiosity to see, you know, what kind of wetland might that be? Sometimes it ends up being non-wetland. One example is it picks up on, I don't know, I've had this conversation with, describe these scenarios with the folks in central office. I think in some cases, maybe in your case, but just by way of example, where the banks of a river are steep enough and or have high hemlock on them.
Yep.
Because I looked at satellite imagery of some of those that I've either gone by or just seen myself, or just knowing some of those areas. It's not, well, those typically.
Yeah, because I've also seen on the map, or like, I have a topography map, like survey everything. The high point goes around like a little valley, the high point is more wetlands, and the low point is not. So it's. So basically, the map is not accurate, it's kind of.
That's what Pat is saying before that.
It's on
It has to
the
be on the ground. So everything you see online, helps us, sort of the tools for us to try to make a correct determination. Sometimes we can't from desktop review, that's when we have to have. And again, we have that, process where you can review a decision. You know there's no method, and you get a positive GD. Then you go through the appeals process. And you come out and tell the bill.
And even so, like, I had a survey done just a couple of years ago, it is only set right on the map, there is no wetlands. He was good.
I would say. Role, and it sounds like a scenario that oftentimes used to while we're on the phone, you know, we pretend like the mapping or. To look at the same places and. It's what I'm seeing that you might not be, you know, what you see. So I understand. I understand what you're saying. But yeah, all maps are interesting, right?
You have a question? I'm sorry, we're having some difficulty hearing.
What now?
Or a permit.
Let me get you the mic. The mic.
Are you saying the JP takes 90 days or the DEC permit?
That TP can take up to 90 days.
It's taken me 7 months to get a DEC permit, in my opinion. And I'm in the 100-foot buffer, so I'm 100 foot from the wetlands. I'm near the Cicero Swamp. And my house is in the 100-foot buffer of the. But it's taken me 7 months to get a DEC permit for me to build a garage on my property. And I'm just curious as to, also, luckily I had Aaron Bliss come and do my wetland delineation last year. When I asked about having another delineation, they said, oh no, you don't want to do that. Because this is good for 5 years. We won't be able to get your delineation from the DEC for another year. Just to let you know what we deal with the DEC. It's not a simple thing. You know, you're presenting it as only, oh, it's only gonna take 10 days. Oh, it's only gonna take 90 days. I dealt with this for 7 months. And I had Michael and Rob come in from the DEC for a site visit. Because I went through the paperwork twice with them. And I've been dealing with them for months and months and months. And I finally said, to them, I want to get this done before the snow flies. Well, we'll come out and look at it. And then I finally got a little bit of leeway. Now I've got to deal with Steve Procopio and getting a permit and a variance. So, you know, just because you have a DEC permit means nothing as far as building something. Now you got to go to the town. Now you got to get variance. So I hope you all understand that. This is not me saying that. Thank you.
Anyone else? One more?
What if the property is in, was it designated federal and state wetland?
Yeah, oftentimes they are.
I'm
So
understanding that.
Wetlands are wetlands,
Yes.
yeah. So
So buffer zone is the same, correct? It's very unfreezing.
the DEC has a 100-foot buffer around it, we regulate that, the Army Corps of Engineers and the federal government does not.
The federal government, the federal wetland has no, size limitation, am I correct? Did it say that?
Right, and in some circumstances, like, that was discussing, DEC regulations don't have that threshold anymore, if you're in an area of unusual.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else? That being said, I want to thank you gentlemen for both coming out.
Gentlemen, for being.
Have a great night.